worked together now for I don't know how many years. I really appreciate our partnership. So for everybody tonight, if you could go ahead and fill out the poll that Kelly just launched, we'd love to hear a little bit more about your role. Are you basically a EL or ESL teacher, counselor, social workers, administrators? You can see towards the bottom, I've got homeless liaisons. I'm hoping maybe there's a homeless liaison or two in the group. We'll give you all a little bit more time, and then we'll share the results. There you go. Now it started again. All right.
Got a little carried away with my clicking.
That's okay. Oh, okay. We've got some state education folks. Awesome. All right. Well, let me go ahead and I'm going to end the poll and we will share the results. So majority are ESL teachers, right? Happy to see some classroom and gen ed teachers. Counselors, social workers, awesome. Parent liaisons, yay. Look at all the parent and family engagement staff. That's amazing. And sorry, we ran out of space for an other category. So feel free to put in the chat box if you are other and let us know what you do. All right, so getting very distracted by that ding. All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen. And let's move this here. All right, so in our short time tonight, here is the plan. We're gonna go over some content for hopefully about 45 minutes, maybe even 40. I wanna leave a lot of time for questions and answers. Feel free to drop your questions into the chat box whenever you think of them. And Kelly is going to be kind of keeping track of those throughout, because it's a little hard for me to do all the multitasking. So we'll get to those questions in the last 15-20 minutes. But Kelly, I will say, if there's anything that's like, I don't know, I'm going to try not to use acronyms, but if there's any acronym or something like a burning question that you really need to know before we go on, of course, Kelly, interrupt me so that I can clarify that.
I will.
All righty. All right, we did our poll. All right, so tonight, this content that we're going over tonight is drawing from sort of two things. The first one is, some of you may have seen my blog post on 10 things educators need to know about unaccompanied minors. So that's kind of the theme for tonight. We're going to go over those 10 things, of course, in more detail than is in the blog. And then also, some of you may be aware that I teach a 5-hour course on English Learner Portal called Supporting Unaccompanied Immigrant Youth in U.S. Schools. And so, again, that's 5 hours. It's a pretty complex topic that we're going over. And so tonight, I'm going to give as much information as I can, but it's basically we're barely what's the expression, scratching the surface, right? Also, Kelly, would you mind dropping the PowerPoint link into the chat box again? Because I want to make sure that everybody knows. Everybody has these slides and knows that everything is hyperlinked. So like right here, if I'm hovering over the graphic there I have for 10 things educators need to know, boom, you can click, it'll take you to the blog post. If you click on the 5-hour course, it'll take you to the, the page, that kind of thing. All righty. So we're going to start. If you've read my blog post, let me just say I'm not going over the 10 things in the same order. I kind of changed up the order a bit to help. I think it makes a little more sense like this. So the very first thing is, and any homeless liaisons on this call will probably know this, but the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement, or what you'll hear me say, ORR. We use that word a lot in this field. The Office of Refugee Resettlement. Their definition of unaccompanied minor is not the same as McKinney-Vento. So most of you on this call are K-12, and McKinney-Vento is the law that kind of governs our work with homeless and unaccompanied youth. So their definitions are not the same, but there is overlap, okay? So here is the definition that the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement uses. Their terminology is, now I don't like this word, but their terminology is unaccompanied alien child, okay? Or UAC, or sometimes they'll say UC, okay? The kids that we're talking about, and this is, we see them all in the news, right? All these kids on the border. Here are the 3 criteria. It has to be a child that has no lawful immigration status in the United States, okay? The second one is under 18, haven't yet had their 18th birthday. And the third one is without a parent or legal guardian at the time they're apprehended on the border, okay? So they may be with aunt, uncle, cousin, friend, people they met along the way in their journey. But if they're not with a parent or legal guardian, the federal government is going to identify them as one of these unaccompanied alien children, okay, quote unquote. And it's gonna kick off their entry into this whole system. So here's a little bit about the difference, and kind of we look at the overlap. So if we look at the circle, the white circle, and kind of look on the left there, if we have a student who is just unaccompanied by the Office of Refugee Resettlement definition, this would be a child who crosses the border, again, without a parent or legal guardian, but when they eventually get released from federal custody, and we're going to talk about that tonight, but when they get released, if they get released to mom or dad and then show up in school to register with mom or dad, they're not going to flag any McKinney-Vento, protocols, right? They're just going to seem like a typical registration. Though all of us know, usually we figure out within a few minutes that, wait a minute, this student doesn't really know his mom or dad, right? There's all that goes along with it. But for now, let's kind of focus just on the definitions, right? If we go to the right and look at the dark blue, if we have a student that's just unaccompanied per McKinney-Vento, then this could be a child that crosses the border. They may be with relatives and may or may not get apprehended by Department of Homeland Security. And then they end up living alone or with someone other than their parent or their guardian, right? So a typical situation here, I mean, there's lots of people, kids included, who cross the border who are never apprehended, right? They're never going to be in the Office of Refugee Resettlement system. They're never going to be flagged as one of these unaccompanied alien children. But if they end up living alone or with, aunt or neighbor, cousin's friend, whatever, and they go to register at your school, all the McKinney-Vento flags are going to go off, right? Then in the middle, the overlap, the child who crosses the border, again, alone, right, without their parent or legal guardian, and then they get released from federal custody to someone who does not have legal guardianship of them. And that happens a lot, okay? So I know that's kind of a whirlwind, but here's sort of crazy that we have 2 federal agencies that use 2 different definitions, right? Two departments that don't see this exactly the same, but hopefully this diagram is helpful. All right, I see lots in the chat box. Hopefully, Kelly, you are tracking the questions. All right, so the second item here, second thing for educators to know, the time to prepare is now. In fact, it was yesterday. So here's a little bit about the timeline, okay? I put together this, this graphic. There's a lot to understand about this system, and we won't, unfortunately, have time. I can't, in 45 minutes, explain to you, A to Z how this system works, but in the online course, we do that. But so here's my kind of condensed version. So if a child is apprehended at the border, they're going to be apprehended by the Department of Homeland Security, specifically Customs and Border Protection, which is like a unit within Department of Homeland Security. According to, oh, I forgot to mention this a second ago. Let me back up a minute. On the bottom here, forgot to say this, when we're talking about the definition, you see a little graphic that says the Flores settlement. There is a case from 1997 called the Flores settlement or Flores Agreement that governs all of what we're talking about tonight. And there's a website that created a little graphic novel about it, like a little graphic explainer. So again, if you have the PowerPoint open, you can click on that and it'll take you to the Flores, the picture version of the Flores settlement. All right, backing up to here. Okay, so according to Flores, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, can only keep these kids for a maximum of 72 hours. Okay, sometimes that gets, when there's a huge surge or wave of minors, sometimes that is longer, okay? But when they're in the Department of Homeland Security facilities, these are the ones that we see a lot on the news. When you see the kids in those little fenced in things and people say, oh, the kids are in cages, and you see them with the little aluminum foil blankets, or you hear the stories about kids saying it was like a freezer, things like that. That's when they're in DHS custody, those first 72 hours, okay? Then, per that Flores Agreement, they are required to transfer them to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. There's that ORR I've been talking about, for them to take custody and care of them, okay? Now, again, I don't have time to get into all the different things tonight, but you can read about the different types of ORR facilities. See on the bottom where I have in the pink, and then I hyperlinked, you can read about the type of facilities here. And then, well, I'll say a little bit more about this, but about the process and criteria for family reunification. I included a link to that as well. Currently, it's a little bit, when we have these surges or these waves on the border, what often happens is ORR creates these like influx facilities, which are not their norm. Typically, the average ORR facility is basically a shelter. It's a youth shelter where you have smaller groups of kids, they have group homes, there are some other programs, they have transitional foster care, they have some other longer term foster care. But in general, the typical one is a shelter with, you know, a truly appropriate number of kids per, you know, room or per like group house, right? But in these times of crisis right now, unfortunately, it's something like around half of the kids are going, it's still through ORR, but they're ending up in these much larger influx facilities, either for their whole stay or for the beginning until another like bed opens somewhere. These facilities are all across the country. They're in Chicago, they're in New York, they're in Portland, they're in wherever. It's not just shelters along the border, okay? So then what happens? Everybody goes, why can't you release them to their family right away? Well, that's the goal, right? But there has to be, as you would imagine, at least a little bit of a process, right? Whether it's a parent or an aunt, uncle, grandparent, former neighbor, whoever it is coming forward, they have to do at least a little bit of a background check. They have to make sure that they're not accidentally releasing this kid to a trafficker or someone who does not have their best interest in mind. And so over the years, the amount of time that they're in one of these ORR shelters, it really varies. But currently, the average, I just checked the statistics, it's right around 35 days, okay? So let me back up a second. Remember, DHS custody, really, you know, not good conditions for like 3 days-ish. And then when they go into their ORR facility, it's usually right around a month. And in that month, that's when the social workers and the case managers and people are trying to figure out, okay, who are we releasing this kid to? Where is their family member? Who is this person? Like, all of those kind of details, and then they release them, okay? Keep in mind, wherever they're at, in whatever shelter, they're there more or less because there was bed space, okay? Bed space combined with, especially in slower times, combined with looking at the needs, right? If you have a youth who's LGBTQ or someone who's a victim of trafficking or whatever, there's like specialized facilities, but in general, it's where's there an open bed? And so it really doesn't have anything to do with their ultimate destination. So you could have a youth who's in a shelter in Portland, Oregon, who's trying to get out to reunify with their aunt that's in Annapolis, Maryland. It doesn't have anything to do with each other. Okay, and then the last point on this slide is it's very important for educators to understand that these youth are in deportation proceedings, okay? The whole time. You see my little dotted line. So they're apprehended by immigration authorities just because they get released to family members. That's the government's way of saying, all right, we want somewhere. Well, of course, it's in the kid's best interest from a child welfare perspective to be with family members, right? And it's also the government. I mean, it's like cheaper for the government and all sorts of other reasons. They're like, we want the kids to be with their family members while their immigration case is pending. It's a very long backlog in immigration cases. It's years. So of course you don't want to keep a kid in a shelter for years. So they're with their family member, but it doesn't mean like, woohoo, I'm here for good. It means like, woohoo, you need a lawyer. So yeah, there's a lot to be said about that, but I can't spend too much time, otherwise we'll never get to the 10. All right, so number 3, for a number of reasons, the government does not consider most of these youth to be refugees, okay? So real quick, any of you who have been in any of my workshops before know that I tend to go through kind of all the terminology, and I'll just do a real quick kind of overview of these 3 terms right now. When we talk about immigrants, we're generally talking about individuals who voluntarily come to the United States to permanently stay, and they're looking for maybe work, it could be economic reasons, reunify with family, but in general, the idea is they're voluntarily coming, okay? Versus refugees are individuals who are fleeing persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution, okay? And they are granted protection and permission to come to the United States when they are still overseas, okay? So they might be, I don't know, this would be like you have someone from Somalia who flees to Kenya, they have all their interviews with the government and they get their background checks and, their health screening and all the things when they're still in Kenya, so that by the time they arrive in the United States, they've got their visa in hand, they're good to go, okay? Versus asylum seekers, and this is the category that most of our Central Americans fall in. So these individuals are also fleeing, persecution and other horrible things, right? But they don't ask for protection and permission to stay here until they get here. They tend to show up and then ask. There's a lot of reasons for that. But again, partly it's because the US refugee program is not really accessible to them. So anyway, that's kind of just piggybacking on the other point about how, again, they really need an attorney. Like if you're a school counselor on this call, having a list of pro bono or low cost attorneys, immigration attorneys in your area that you can, you're not endorsing certain ones or whatever, but just like a list of agencies that you can hand to students who may need that list, like that's really, really important for their case, so that they can try to at least apply for asylum, or sometimes there are a few other different categories that they might be able to stay here with. All right, do my little time check. Okay, number 4, our 4th item for educators to know. Youth from Guatemala make up the largest percentage of unaccompanied minors. And these youth often have Indigenous or Maya roots, all right? Here's some statistics from the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement. You see I included the link there. You can go and take a look, but you can see for a number of years now, Guatemala, my gosh, Guatemalans are almost half of the kids coming, okay? Now, do we have a perfect breakdown of like, who's Quiche, who's Mom, who's Chu? No, unfortunately we don't, because a lot of times this population is fairly invisible, right? Depending on how they're, did someone really assess what other languages they speak? Did that enter into their file? That type of thing. That doesn't always happen at the border, and I know it definitely doesn't always happen in our schools. Here is a 1 quick slide overview on our on the Indigenous Maya population. Some of you, especially, I'm going to guess a lot of ESL teachers, this is like, this, right? But there's probably others on this call who this is like brand new information to them. So what you want to know is that there are not only 22 plus, I would say, languages spoken in Guatemala, but I've been learning a lot from some colleagues at the International Mayan League and some other Mayan organizations who, they would really say these are separate Maya nations. This is not just a language. We are Native Americans, and these are our nations. This is our culture. These are our communities. And so a lot of Mayan individuals don't speak Spanish, or if they do, it's Spanish as a second language. A little bit of kind of broader perspective is, if you're not familiar, Guatemala had a 36-year civil war, and I mean, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, and disproportionately it impacted Maya communities. So many people murdered, and so these communities are dealing with this historical level of trauma and persecution. And the second to the last bullet there is really important for any of you who are involved in doing the home language survey or registering students. These communities, literally, they have a history of surviving by hiding their identities. So are they going to voluntarily be like, I'm Quiche? No, probably not. So you have to think about your forms, how sensitive you are in your conversations with them. Do you make them feel welcome? Do you make them feel comfortable? Do you automatically, when you hear Guatemala, say like, oh, habla otro idioma? Like, what else do you speak? Oh, you speak mom? Oh, da 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 da, like that kind of thing. Building that trusting relationship. It may take a little kind of time for people to sort of open up. And then the last thing is just, a lot of Central Americans overall, when we look at sort of push and pull factors for migration, we hear a lot about the gangs, we hear lots about community violence and that type of thing. But one of the other reasons that a lot of Guatemalans, and in particular Indigenous communities, are leaving is because there are lots of conflicts over land and natural resources. So like multinational corporations that come in and they're mining and doing things that really mess up the resources and the community's ability to farm and eat. I know this is an area that I've been learning a little bit more about from some of my Mayan colleagues. So sometimes their reasons for migrating may be a little different. It may not be because of gang violence or other community violence. So that's my wham bam boom version of what you need to know about the Mayans. Now you can understand why some of these trainings are longer, right? All right, so number 5. This is all expertise, right? I come more with a social work background, but you all know that a lot of these students have limited or interrupted formal education. And hopefully some of you attended Brenda and Judy's webinar. I think that was last week, maybe the week before. Kelly, feel free to maybe throw the recording link in the chat box if you have it handy. So that they did a great job. For any of you who are kind of not familiar so much with schooling in Central America, and this is a kind of broader. Now I'm speaking about El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. But many families cannot afford to send their children to school. So even if you read or they tell you like, oh yeah, like the school was free in my country, but maybe the uniforms weren't, or the textbooks, or there were other fees, right? Or maybe the family just needed them to work. They needed their student to work. They can't afford to really have them go to school and not have them working the farms or what have you. Some people, their reason will be more the community violence. I've definitely heard that from Salvadorans before, where they said, miss, I couldn't walk to school. It was just too dangerous. So with a lot of these, for a lot of these reasons, it's very common in Central America to only make it to 6th grade, if not less. I know for me here in the Washington, D.C. region, I've worked with many Central American parents who, I would ask them, oh, were you able to go to school, back home? Oh yeah, I went to second grade, or I went to third grade. Maybe the dad went to sixth, something like that. So of course you got to think about that not only with the students, but in any of your family engagement efforts or initiatives. And then of course you often get a situation where it's kind of like a one-room schoolhouse kind of scenario, and the schooling tends to be of poor quality in rural areas. And I included one picture with, looks like my source got a little bit cut off, but in the lower left-hand corner, if you see, it should be hyperlinked, and it'll take you to the article that there was an article that gave some photographs and some more information about kind of common situations of rural schooling in Central America. All right. Halfway, we did 5 out of 10. So number 6, you can look up data, really great data on unaccompanied minors in your area. And so again, hopefully you all have opened the PowerPoint link because these are, hyperlinked for you. The first one, remember the federal government does their, federal fiscal year is October 1st to September 30th, right? Yeah, 30th. And so we are now 6 months into federal fiscal year 21. So anyway, you can look at the data by county, okay? One thing to notice is that somewhere in the top, it gives like a little caveat that says, you only appear on this chart if you have at least 50 unaccompanied minors in your area or something like that. So if your county, if you have 10, 20, 30, you're not unfortunately going to make the list. They only start including you if it's more than 50. I'm not really sure why they do that. The other thing is you can really look at data going back several years. Like I think it goes back 6, 7 years. So I know for me, as soon as I get a training request from a school district and they're like, Laura, we want you to come and do a workshop on unaccompanied minors, I go straight to this chart. I look at, their county, I look at the surrounding counties, I make a little spreadsheet, look at the numbers, here's how it's grown over the years. I did this for the Houston area. Whew, those of you who are in the Houston area, my gosh, you have the largest number of unaccompanied minors coming to your area than any other place in the country. Harris County was like thousands of kids per year. It was blowing me away. But anyway, this is a great tool, I think, for advocacy. And remember, most people in your districts, they're going to be like, well, this doesn't match our McKinney-Vento numbers. Correct. It's not going to match because of what we talked about earlier. So there's a lot of explaining that has to go on in terms of, who are these kids? And the kids, even if they're reunited with mom or dad, and they're not flagged in your school system data in any way, shape, or form, you and I know that those kids are still going to need a lot of support, whether on the instructional side or the social emotional / I haven't seen my parents in 10 years side, right? There's a lot going on there. All right, moving along. I'm going to quick sip of water. All right, moving along. I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions. So number 7, this is a very interesting one that I'm going to guess most people on this call don't know a lot about. So remember in my chart, when I talked about, okay, Department of Homeland Security, they have them for about 72 hours. Then they go into the Office of Refugee Resettlement Care for an average of, what did I say it was, 35 days or something like that, right? A little bit over a month. Well, in that time, they're in ORR care. They actually receive 6 hours of instruction per day. Okay. Now, this is a little bit about what the Flores Agreement says they have to have. And I'm going to tell you, the education services vary greatly between facilities. And it's kind of a black hole. There's not a lot written about it. There's a few articles, there's a few little things here and there, but for the most part, everyone's like, we don't know what happens, okay? But here's some of the basics. So They have this right to the academic, they call them academic educational services. They have to get some form of assessment, and I'm going to use that term kind of loosely, within the first 72 hours of arrival. They have to be in a structured classroom setting, which I know was thrown off a lot with COVID, just like it was for us. I talked to some educators in a shelter in Chicago, and they were like, yeah, we had them on, tablets in their rooms and the shelter, and we kind of like ran from room to room, like everyone was trying to do creative things just like you all were doing. And then there's a list of the subjects that they cover. Well, since this is such a, like I said, kind of a black hole, sort of this mystery, I started poking around and trying to talk to some of the teachers in some of these ORR shelters. And you have to understand that this is it's a very sensitive kind of thing. Not the education piece itself, but the ORR shelters. Like some of them, remember, are serving kids who are victims of trafficking. So some of them are in confidential locations, right? Then you have all the PR issues. ORR wants things to, to look a certain way. In general, the public confuses what DHS is doing with the aluminum blankets and the cages and all this from what ORR is doing. There's like all these layers of why people are not just, kind of out there with all of this information. But I used to work with one of the agencies that's involved in this system, and I kind of have enough connections that I can kind of weasel my way in a bit. And so we started a few of these, what I'm just calling like teacher to teacher exchanges, where teachers in ORR shelters can get on Zoom with some of us public school teachers and talk shop. Now, we did get permission to record these, but we're not allowed to post them publicly. We're only allowed to post them in the online class that we teach, because they really wanted to make sure that people who were listening to the information had that larger context. They had sat through, me explaining the whole system and so on and so forth. But I will say that there is one public webinar that I am aware of, and I linked to it below, that was done, it was literally just last week or maybe the week before, that was put on by Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services and a couple of educators from shelters. They were gearing this webinar actually to organizations, think like shelter type organizations, that were thinking about contracting with the Office of Refugee Resettlement to work with these kids. And so they presented this webinar more as like, hey, here's what you need to know. Here's what you're going to have to do in terms of 6 hours of instruction per day if you get one of these contracts. But I found it very useful because they were talking about the assessments that they do and like how they divide up things and their students and student teacher ratios. So we got permission to share that one. So at least you can take a look at that. All right, number 8, the importance of learning about trauma-informed practices. So we've got, kind of trauma-informed practices in general. Then we kind of think a little bit more about, okay, what does that look like for immigrant and refugee students? And then what does that specifically look like for unaccompanied minors, right? So it's like this little piece of the pie. I put this image here because many of you know, but maybe some of you don't know or have a sense of just how horrific a lot of the journeys are that our students go through to get here. This is a train, sometimes called the Beast, that a fair amount of kids and families will ride on top of through Mexico. As you can imagine from what it looks like here, it is not designed to carry people. This is a cargo train, but it's if you don't have resources to find another way. I mean, in some cases, if you're desperate enough, this is your best option for how you're going to get from point A to point B. But people fall off, they lose limbs, people are raped, there's gangs controlling the top. You can read Enrique's Journey if you want to learn a little bit more about that. Enrique's Journey by Sonia Nazario, and there's some other books out there that kind of document a lot of the trauma. So I wanted to include this slide here. Again, it's hyperlinked, and we won't have time for sure to go into most of this now, but this is a graphic that some folks at Boston Children's Hospital have put together. They actually put together a refugee and immigrant, they call it their core stressors toolkit. The main woman behind this work, her name is Dr. Heidi Ellis, Ellis. And as far as I'm concerned, she's like the main expert on immigrant children and trauma in the United States. And the reason why I really like this model or this graphic is the fact that it's 4 areas, right? You see the trauma in the blue, the acculturative stress in the orange, the sort of resettlement in the pink, and the isolation in the green. And so I think sometimes we, as educators, might know that a student has a really, you know, maybe experienced a lot of trauma in their home country. Maybe they saw a family member murdered or something like that, right? And we kind of hone in on this blue section. But at the same time, that student may be experiencing a ton of stress related to acculturating, right? Including learning the language. In this model, you'll see there that they kind of lumped language with acculturation. In their own family, there might be different levels of acculturation occurring and kind of gaps and family, stress around all of that. Or if you go to the resettlement part, the pink part here, this is all the poverty related things. A lot of our unaccompanied youth, maybe they are, to be released from federal custody, you have to be released to someone. But unfortunately, there are situations where, you get released to someone and maybe it's like your mom's second cousin or something who agreed to sign you out of federal custody, but really didn't have a whole lot of intentions of caring for you. And then before you know it, you're kind of on your own, right? And so, situations where youth are paying rent, they're working full-time jobs on top of going to school. They're undocumented. They're trying to fight their asylum cases. So all the stress, associated with that. And then the lower left here, the isolation. So thinking about all the sources of social support, maybe back home, they lived in a tight-knit community and they had friends, they had church, they had what have you. And then here they're kind of just sort of plopped down and need an opportunity to kind of rebuild that sense of support. Or in your school, maybe there's a lot of bias and discrimination or bullying, right? So I like this model because it really helps us to see that, yes, like certain key traumatic incidents that may have happened in a student's past, yeah, like that's important, but so are all these other areas. And in some cases, some of these other areas are actually more stressful and traumatic for students right now. Like what is affecting them and bothering them the most right now? All right, a couple of books that I wanted to share, resources, because again, this could be a very long topic. The book on the left is by Heidi Ellis. So the woman I mentioned earlier, there's other authors there too, but she's the lead author. And as a social worker, I must give a shout out. We call it the socio-ecological approach or framework. That's very powerful in looking at these different kind of layers that affect students. And I circled there, you'll see that chapter 6 is looking at how we can integrate mental health care into school settings. The second book, there's a chapter on immigrant students. I know the 2 authors, one used to be my boss, in fact, and that's a really great chapter. And then also, for those of you who heard Brenda and Judy last week on the other English Learner Portal webinar on SLIFE, this is their book, Supporting the Journey of English Learners After Trauma. And I highlighted at the bottom, they have a chapter on instructional strategies and classroom activities that foster resilience. So the first 2 books are written by social workers or other mental health professionals, whereas Judy and Brenda's book is written by teachers. And so like, if you really want kind of that instructional strategies framework, you might want the yellow book there. All right, number 9, going along with this. It's very, very important to remember that teachers, not just school counselors or other, psychologists or what have you, play an incredibly important role in the mental health and social emotional support of our unaccompanied minors. In social work and public health and a number of other fields, we talk a lot about risk factors and protective factors. So risk factors, you probably know what I mean by risk factors, but protective factors are the things that buffer and kind of like counteract or counterbalance the risk factors. And so you'll see in the bullets there, the 4 bullets, let's hone in on the first 3. These are 3 protective factors that I think teachers can have a huge impact on. So school connectedness. So that is a big thing. You might think that, I don't know, some of these like lunch bunches or after school clubs or things that you're doing, are great, but maybe you don't even realize like those have truly an impact on the mental health and social emotional wellness of students. Like per the research, okay? So anything that you can do to help students feel connected and like they belong, right? And then the second one, their peer support, that they have relationships with their peers. Huge, 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 okay? And then the third one, I'll just mention really quickly, what they mean by integrative acculturation style is essentially being bicultural. So kids do the best in terms of outcomes and mental health and all of that if they're essentially taking the best of both worlds, their home country and their new country. If they only want to stick with the old, their outcomes aren't as good. If they only want to quote unquote Americanize, their outcomes aren't as good. If they really take the best of both worlds and develop a healthy bicultural identity, that's when they do the best. Okay, and I don't have time to go into family cohesion, but for all the family engagement people out there, take a look at this article because that will help bolster your work as well. And then finally, all my ESL teachers are gonna hooray when they see this, right? These students are not just the EL teacher's responsibility, okay? I'm on all of the Facebook groups, the ESL K-12, the advocating for ES, like all the things. This is a topic that comes up like every 5 minutes. It's like, why does everyone think that like every need that this student has is my problem, like is my issue, to solve? We need everyone to really help out. And so a few tips, I hope there's some administrators. I think we saw there were some administrators on this call. I highly recommend this book, Educational Leadership of Immigrants. They have a whole section on school leadership, district leadership, and community leadership. So it's really neat to see a book that is really looking at the leadership lens. And for any administrators on this call, I want you to think about, if at all possible, and not only for unaccompanied minors, for any immigrant or English learners, hiring liaisons with your immigrant communities, not only for the language, but for the cultural piece, essentially hiring, cultural brokers. PD for teachers, that's the business I'm in and Kelly's in, and, PD is needed, right? The SLIFE programming piece, having some newcomer programming, I can't talk, or other programming for our students with limited or interrupted formal education. One tip there, number 4, that I'd like to share, when I was working in a district with Kelly, in fact, in Maryland some years ago, in 2014, when we had that, there was a big wave in 2014 of unaccompanied minors, if some of you remember. We just called it a community conversation on unaccompanied minors and immigrant family reunification or something like that, and invited tons of community partners to the table. They were all like, who? What? We have unaccompanied minors? We had no idea. And like, we just started a conversation, and it was really helpful in breaking down some of those barriers when you're collaborating with community partners. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. We'll just do a few more for teachers and then we'll open it up for questions. So for teachers, all you teachers out there, again, there's that creating a sense of belonging. So important. Basically, the number one thing you can do. There's the piece about encouraging biculturalism and bilingualism. I know we tend to talk a lot about bilingualism, but I don't hear as much talk or emphasis on the bicultural piece, and that, from a mental health standpoint, is very, very important. I think most of you know that a lot of times, if you are working with students who have dealt with a lot of trauma, that having structure and routines is helpful. But of course, you also want to have some flexibility there and maybe a support system kind of in place if there are some unexpected things that go down, or someone starts crying, or what have you. And then, of course, recognizing some of the events that may trigger our students. And for those of you who are in an area where you have CBO there, that stands for community-based organizations. So if you have the, Hispanic or Latino community, blah, 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 or the, we have, even in DC, we have some Mayan organizations. So the, Mayan community of the whatever, whatever, whoever those organizations are, if you don't know them, find them. And if you don't have them, you'll often find like pastors sometimes, or there's other places that people gather and other kind of informal community networks. So you really want to tap into that. And then my last tip for teachers, some of you may remember, if you read my blog, that I wrote a blog post that kind of went a bit viral on teachers not overstepping boundaries. And some of that being, of course, for your own self-care, but then also it being for what's in the best interest of students. All right, so I'm going to stop there. That was a lot of information. I probably should have just kept to maybe 5 things instead of all 10, but Kelly, let's open it up for questions. And I'll stop sharing for now, and then I'll mention the course later.
So far, I haven't seen any question. There's been some sharing and some thank yous and good information, but I don't see any questions yet. So feel free to unmute and ask a question, or put it in the chat box.
All right, and while they're doing that, then I will share a little bit more about the course. So again, tonight was like a whirlwind of a few key items that I cover in this 5-hour course. But as you can see here, I put the syllabus on the right there. It's broken down into 3 modules. So essentially the first one is who are unaccompanied youth, right? Their journeys, like who's coming here, all of that. The second module is what happens from the border to locating a sponsor. So if this information is new to you, you're like, who's ORR? Never heard of them before. That's where this really gets into that. The Flores Agreement, all of that. And then the last module is on family reunification and community integration. So once they're released, that family member, what happens? What are some of those dynamics look like? How does this all work in schools? What can we do? That kind of thing. And that's of course asynchronous, but if you prefer synchronous learning, I am doing 2 live workshops on Zoom in July covering that same content. So those are the dates, and there is the link. All right, any questions come in yet?
We do have a couple. So someone said, please give an example of overstepping boundaries. I'm worried about doing this.
Yeah, okay. So again, I do include a lot of examples in the article. I definitely encourage everyone to read the blog post, but an example would be, gosh, this one, I can think of so many, but okay, let's say you become really pretty close with one of your students and they start confiding in you that, let's say they're cutting like their arm, right? Like they're cutting their wrist, or they're starting to even, you hear them mention the word suicide, or I don't want to be here anymore, or something like that. And you're like, well, I'm the one who speaks Spanish in the building, and like, I know them best. And you try to start navigating that situation instead of, walking them down or helping connect them with the school counselor, even if the school counselor doesn't speak Spanish, even if you think they know nothing about your population, on and on and on and on. You got to resist that urge of like, but I know them best, but you don't have the mental health skills. And that can be a really, tricky situation. So that's one that comes to mind. Another one, I just have to say this. There are many times with this population where, again, whoever the federal government released them to, that situation may break down and not work. And what's supposed to happen is you're supposed to contact, ORR does have a hotline that can sometimes provide some resources, but in general, if you have a minor that has no caregivers, you have to call CPS, you have to call Child Protective Services. But unfortunately, in a lot of parts of the country, our CPS systems are not so great in general, or there are not like turf issues, but they sort of think, well, these kids were released, they're like involved in this federal system. Like they're not our like problem. I don't want to say problem, but like they're not our concern, or they're not in our like jurisdiction almost. And it takes a lot of advocacy sometimes. And so I've literally seen a teacher who took a student home before. No, like major red flags right there. There have to be other ways to do things. So anyway, I'll stop there. Kelly, next one.
Okay, there's some good ones coming in now. Let me find the next one in order. Do you have examples of school districts that are adapting to the needs, like the graduation requirements, the needs of slave students who are older and without as many credits? That's more the instructional side, but you might have some folks you've talked to.
Yeah, I mean, I would say for the instructional side, probably watch the SLIFE webinar from last week, but a little bit more from, I mean, not just the social emotional side, but just kind of like the broader perspective. I mean, some of the districts here in the Washington, D.C. area do pretty great. Like there's some districts in Virginia where, again, these are large districts though. Some of these districts around here have like 200,000 students. And so they have a whole, not just one homeless liaison, they have like a whole homeless team, right? And then they've developed this like unaccompanied minor point person or team. There's some of that going on. One other group district, I don't know if there's anyone here from Palm Beach County Schools, but I know Florida, they have an entire Mayan outreach team, because they have such a large indigenous Guatemalan population that they've developed. They have like Conjobal and Mom and other Mayan outreach folks. So they're pretty tuned into the needs too of these youth.
Okay, do you have links to refugee organizations for information and immigration support?
Probably need to narrow that question down a little bit. I mean, I have tons of refugee and immigrant organizations that I know of. Maybe
that's coming from Deb, so you can check.
Oh, okay.
Check with her.
Deb, you can message me later, or email me and tell me a little bit more. I mean, again, remember, these kiddos, unfortunately, almost never get refugee status. Okay, so you're looking probably more at like organizations in your community that provide pro bono immigration assistance and things like that, like the organization KIND, Kids in Need of Defense. That's a big one that has a lot of national chapters. Also, the Young Center, Young, the Young Center, they're based, I believe their headquarters are in Chicago, but they also have chapters around the country, and they do some really amazing work in providing these kids with a, what's the word? Not guardian ad litem, maybe that's the right word, like an advocate type person to help determine like they listen to the kid's story and help figure out what's in that kid's best interest. But they're an organization, I follow them very closely on social media and follow all their things because they're, again, it's the young center. They know they really have a good understanding of what's going on in these shelters. And so you could follow them too. Those would be two that I recommend.
Okay. All right, so Laura, I'll put this to you. There are some other questions there, but we're right at our hour mark. Do you?
Yeah, I'll stick around and answer some more.
Okay. I put a resource in, I know there's so many things in the chat box right now, and I don't want you to miss it, but a group that Laura and I worked with when we were working in the same district, the National Compadres Network.
Oh yeah, how could I forget them? Duh.
I highly, highly recommend. We worked with them and a few of the other districts around where we were working, worked with them. And they do trauma healing with a cultural base, a Mayan base behind it. And they just have wonderful people, and they'll come to the district and do training, and you train your circle keepers, and they teach you how to do groups in schools or through community organizations. Highly recommend them. National Compadres Network. If you need a connection, send me an email. They're wonderful people.
Yeah.
So let's see what else is
We have still people entering for tonight. I'm like, it's over.
I know the doorbell's still going.
The doorbell is still going off. But yeah, I'll stick around for a little bit.
Okay, would you speak to overage youth and legal counsel at the border?
Overage youth and legal counsel at the border. Well, okay, so here's the thing. I don't know if I fully understand your question, but if you have someone who is 18 or over 18, they're not going into this whole system that I just described. Unfortunately, they're going, they're either, if they, as an adult, have their own children, perhaps like a baby with them in tow or whatever, there are a couple of family detention facilities. Okay, I'm not an expert on those. I've never been to one. I don't know a whole lot, but I know there are a few of them. But for most people, again, if this is someone over 18 and they're an adult and they're going to ask for asylum, unfortunately, they're going into adult detention, immigration detention, while they're going to, walk through their immigration case. I've been to some of the adult immigration facilities before. There's some organizations throughout the United States that allow you to sign up to be a friendly visitor for immigrants in detention, whether they were apprehended at the border or they were like rounded up in the community kind of thing. They usually are given lists of, low cost or pro bono immigration attorneys in there. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but again, in our mind, we see them as overage youth. We're like, these are our students, but the federal government, in terms of immigration, you're 18, off to adult, immigration detention you go, and then you're not going to school. You're going to be in jail, unfortunately. Sashi, did you want to say?
Yeah, so that was my question. Because what we are getting is you get that kid who's like 17 years and 11 months old. They're told that if they come to school, they have a better chance of living in this country. So that's one. But
Wait, who's telling them that?
Huh?
Who is telling them that?
What they tell us is when they're coming, so I'm guessing it's some kind of legal aid that they get at the border. Because I've had this, and I've even had a USCRI case manager who mentioned something similar to me, saying, well, they have the right to go to school till they're 21. So why can't they go now? And we're like, that's fine if they come, but y'all are also telling them that they can leave school at the age of 18. So they're literally with us for 2 months. And then they drop out because they're being told that they can.
It sounds like a lot of, conflicting messages.
Yeah. So I just didn't know, is there a way we can, gather some of this information and contact somebody to just get some streamlined information of what they're telling and how we can guide them?
Well, again, there's so many different sort of cooks in the kitchen for this topic. Unfortunately, there is no one place to go, but that's sort of what I'm trying to start up a bit with these teacher to teacher conversations, because I think what the educators in the ORR shelters, again, not everyone's going to go through that system, but a lot of our students are, right? So if they're in that system, whatever messaging they're hearing from them is crucial, because they're only with them for a month, but a big part of what they're trying to do is to kind of orient them and prepare them for school when they get out, public school. How are you going to enroll? What do you have to do to register? What do you have to do to graduate? Like all of those things. So that's a bit of what I'm trying to do with that, because unfortunately, I don't know if I should be surprised about this or not, but all of these ORR shelters all around the United States that have all these teachers, there's no mechanism in place right now, even for them to collaborate, let alone for all of them to collaborate with us. So there's no like listserv we can go to be like, hey, teachers, like, or other ORR shelter workers, like, what messaging are you sending? That doesn't exist, unfortunately. Maybe one more question, Kelly, one or two.
Okay, are the unaccompanied minors arriving with little English proficiency, or does it vary between ages?
I would say, I mean, I don't have any statistics, unfortunately, on that. Probably you all could speak to that better than I could, but I will say this. I did have recently, I don't know if you're on this webinar, but there was an educator from Colorado who asked me a really good question. She said, Laura, why can't the ORR shelters do the WIDA screener? If they have to do some kind of assessment, why can't they do the WIDA, get their number, and then it'll be easier to help them transition when they come to register, in our schools. And so I've been poking around with that and talking to some folks to see about that. I mean, obviously, WIDA has their whole consortium and the way it's set up. But I did learn, and maybe some of you know this, that the Bureau of Indian Affairs, as well as the DoD schools, those two federal agencies became part of the WIDA consortium. So ORR could become part of the consortium if they wanted to. And then at least there would be some data, right? We'd have some data on WIDA levels coming to us. That's all I could really contribute to that. But Kelly, I don't know if you want to add anything to like experiences with that.
I mean, I don't know the data either, but just from real life experiences, I think the majority coming in with very little English, and the English that tends to be there is kind of that survival business. Like,
right.
If you're doing, working at a market or selling or working in tourist areas or something before coming, that there's some of that kind of, survival English at best. But I mean, anything is possible.
Yeah.
But I would say you can plan on the majority.
Right. That's
not
what
being.
Yeah. I mean, if you're dealing with many students who, like we were showing in the slides, didn't make it to 6th grade kind of thing or less. So we're dealing with SLIFE, and then Spanish is a second language for a lot of the Guatemalans and all the layers. Yeah. All right, man, we still have 3 pages worth of people here.
There are lots of questions, but I think for the sake of time, if you still have questions, I'm going to leave the meeting open so you can keep putting them in the chat box. And then when everyone's finished, Laura, I'll send you a copy of the chat. And if you could maybe go through and do a FAQ or something like that, where you could answer some, we can send via email.
I can try. I just also encourage, if people can possibly join the course or one of the sessions in July. I mean, I'm going to go through all of this in a lot more detail. Unfortunately, they're not free, but they're pretty affordable. The live ones are $49. The self-paced one is $69. I mean, I hate to mention that now, but again, this is kind of like how we make our living. So I wish I could offer everything for free, but that in those 2 options, I will be going over all of this in way more detail. But yeah, Kelly, I can take a look at the chat.
Okay, and we can answer some of them together because some are more instructional, like newcomer programs and things. So
Yeah.
we can put our heads together on that.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. And Kelly, thanks for this opportunity. It's so amazing. So many passionate educators on this call. I mean, literally, there's 3 screens still of people at the end of the school year on what is today? Wednesday, a Wednesday night, voluntarily, sitting here soaking up information to support students. So thank you all. I bow down to you for all of you are doing for your students and families. I guess I'm signing off. Thank you, Kelly, and everybody.